Welcome to the Stormsurf video surf forecast for the week starting Sunday, May 8th. Looking at significant wave heights for the North Pacific Ocean, we see not a whole lot going on. Small low pressure area here north of Hawaii generating 14, 15 foot seas, pushing towards the island, good for production of wind swell. And a new low is starting to develop over the Kuril Islands, perhaps going to generate some slightly larger seas and one last pulse of swell for probably Hawaii and even less for the U.S. West Coast. But at this point in time, it looks like things are really starting to simmer down. Let's take a look at the details. First up, we'll take a look at jet stream level winds. These winds up about 30,000 feet help support the formation of gales, and when those gales do form, help direct their track. We're looking for troughs, that is a dip in the jet, sort of like here, that creates a counterclockwise circulation aloft and down at the surface, and that is the hallmark of low pressure. Low pressure, of course, generates wind. Winds generate seas. Seas, as they radiate away from the fetch area, produce swell, and swell, when it reaches your beach, creates surf. So we have a little bit of a trough here, though most of the winds in this area, 130 knots, are on the east side of the trough, and that really doesn't help build a fetch or low pressure aimed in any of the directions that we're interested in. You really want the fetch to be falling down into the trough, sort of like this trough here, a secondary trough, but this is rather small and pinched off and with only 120 knot winds, and it's sort of merging with what was previously another cutoff low right here. This is what's generating low pressure that we saw pushing towards Hawaii, and then the jet splits from there and is no longer supportive of gale development. Roll this out, and as you see now, this trough off of the Kurils come Monday gets a little bit better organized. 140 knot winds start developing in the western quadrant just for a little bit here. In the southern quadrant. And then it starts fading out. And again, this other little trough here north of Hawaii kind of it gets cut off and loses its energy source. Most of the energy is pushing up into Alaska. There's a bit of this continuous split thing going on. Given May, this is not unusual. Now, interesting, when we get into Thursday, a better organized trough starts developing here in the western Gulf with 150 knot winds feeding it, that should help to support gale formation. Also notice this little cutoff low starts working its way towards California by Friday, but eventually it moves into the Pacific Northwest and rather weak. And after that, the jet looks rather fragmented, not particularly organized, till we get in about 180 hours out. El Nino is still probably supporting the jet, especially notice that the whole thing is down here around 40 north. For this time of year, it's pretty far south and streaming into California. And actually, when does that start? Looking for weather relative to California, probably the latter part of the weekend would be our guess. So jet stream, not horribly bad, but given that we're rapidly approaching, we're in spring, moving towards summer. It's going to take some serious wind energy aloft to generate a low of any interest, and that's probably not going to happen. Let's go take a look down at the surface. So here we go, surface level pressure, surface level winds. As expected, low pressure is over the Kuril Islands, doing better than expected looking at from just the jet stream with 35, almost little patches of 40 knot winds there, starting to get traction on the ocean surface. And as we saw before, also this little cutoff low here north of Hawaii generating 25 knot winds aimed somewhat at Hawaii, good for wind swell. Put this into motion. You see this fetch just really by Monday, it starts dying out, and we just have this 20 knot winds doesn't cut it. You really need 35 knot winds, and just looking as we go through time here, you're just not seeing it. Here's that little cutoff low circulating off the California coast, and it too fades out. Now here's where things get interesting. Remember, we saw another trough that's forecast in the western Gulf come the weekend. A low pressure system tries to develop there, but winds they barely get to 30 knots, and that fades out, and then pretty much it's all over unless some miracle happens. And then finally, let's take a look at significant waves height. Of course, winds generate the seas. Let's see if there are any. And as you saw right there, what is that? Maybe 15-foot seas, somewhat targeting Hawaii. Then here's this fetch trying to get organized off of the Kuril Islands. You get 22, maybe 23-foot seas out of it. That'll be good for a little pulse of swell energy into Hawaii, and maybe even less for the U.S. West Coast. 5 or plus days out. But that system fades out. Then we start looking to see what happens from the gale that's supposed to develop over the western Gulf, and we're not seeing, there's a little bit, but not much really. Maybe good for wind swell for Hawaii, and that's it. And then 180 hours out, it's over, suggesting that the North Pacific is really winding down for the season. Let's go take a look at the southern hemi. So back a week ago, this is Sunday the 1st of May, there was a gale. It actually had a higher seas than this. It was up to 32-foot seas, but this is the last frame we have in the hindcast model here. What is that, about 20, 22, 24, 25, 26-foot seas? Swell from this has already hit Hawaii and has passed, is starting to show in Southern California, and is expected into Northern California Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday time frame. Nothing huge by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely rideable southern hemiswell for the entire coast of California from this. And then just last Friday, that is May 7th, another little system started developing under New Zealand here, 30-foot seas, and it worked its way, 32-foot seas, but notice it was sort of falling almost, it's going straight east, almost southeast, not doing a whole lot. But then come Sunday, it started pushing, that is today, to the northeast, and right about here, this looks about where it's peaking out. I'll go right about there. In the 33-foot range, aimed to the northeast, the thought is yet another swell could be generated by this. It would arrive about a week out, so maybe late in the weekend next week into the early part of so what are we talking about? 8 days out, roughly. So something to look forward to from that. Really, it looks like most of the swell production now is originating from the southern hemi. Let's go take a look at the forecast for the next 7 days. So here we go. This is the 18Z run of the model Sunday, and as we talked about, 33-foot seas pushing their way northeast, fading out by sometime Monday. A secondary little fetch behind that, actually looking a little better than it had on previous models, so that's good. And yet a tertiary fetch now projected with 32-foot seas into Wednesday. This could result in a pretty good long run of small swell for California, probably a 4, 5, 6 day run of surf. Nothing huge, but still surf nonetheless. At this point, it's beggars can't be choosy. Take what you can get. Then we look at the models going a week out. After that, things kind of back off. So that pulse of swell we saw, or seas that we saw, is probably going to be it for a little bit. Let's go take a look at long-term projections. So first up, we're looking for the presence of the MJO. This is time of year. The MJO typically is not present and doesn't do much, but we're also sort of looking to see what impacts El Nino, if any, still has. As of right now, strong trades. This is the equator, East Pacific here, West Pacific here, New Guinea there. Trades are in control, even in the Kelvin wave generation area. A little bit pocket of calmer winds down in here, but certainly no westerly winds. Looking not even really any westerly anomalies, but if anything, kind of a normal pattern given the time of year. There's actually some suggestion of westerly anomalies here, but we're just looking at the winds right now. Now let's go take a look at the MJO. And here's the model we use to look at presence of westerly winds or westerly anomalies. West Pacific here, East Pacific here. Kelvin wave generation, date lines right here. Kelvin wave generation area is down right along in here. We see pockets of westerly anomalies earlier in April, but the forecast for the next week, at least per this model, up at 4,200 feet at the 850 millibar level, suggests actually easterly anomalies, which clearly would indicate the inactive phase of the MJO. So nothing here to support fueling the jet stream and getting a late season pulse of swell out of the North Pacific. Next, we look at the forecast for the MJO, multiple models, multiple different outcomes. Right now, the current status is this yellow-oranges suggests the inactive phase of the MJO, more sunlight reflectivity off the ocean's surface. That means high pressure and the inactive phase, with the active phase trying to develop south of India. less sunlight reflectivity, more clouds, and of course the active phase. The 2-week forecast suggests the inactive phase to fade, the active fade, at least this per the statistical model, perhaps easing west a little bit into the West Pacific, whereas the dynamic model, the GFS ensemble, suggests the inactive phase holding control and the active phase hold up here in the Indian Ocean. Another way to look at this, these are phase diagrams. Write this circle, assume this is the North Pole. You're looking down on the top of the planet, and the MJO rotates from the Indian Ocean over the maritime continent across the date line to the West Pacific, over the Americas, over Africa, and then back to the Indian Ocean, counterclockwise. If you're down here in this circle, that means the MJO is extremely weak. Right now, the active phase of the MJO is indicated in the Indian Ocean and building strength as it moves somewhat towards the maritime continent, that per the ECMF model. The GFS model, GEFS, projects basically the same sort of thing, but what we really need is the active phase to move over the maritime continent and preferably over the West Pacific, and we don't see that occurring for the next 2 weeks. Then finally, we look at the CFS model. Again, anomalies forecasted up at 850 millibar level, about 4,500 feet up in the air. Past history on the bottom half of the chart here, January, big westerly wind burst. Another one in March, little tiny one here in April. But here's the current date, and from here on, no westerly anomalies forecast. Not really any easterly anomalies forecast either. The MJO, right here, very weak, ill-defined. Kelvin wave generation area is right in here. If anything, the inactive phase of the MJO, just like what the GFS model is projecting, is to be in control at least through the end of May, and then maybe some sort of weak active phase in late June, July, but basically a very weak MJO pattern. This is somewhat interesting. If El Nino was going to come roaring in, La Nina was going to come roaring in, one would expect to see the inactive phase of the MJO really taking hold, and it's not. This is because we believe El Nino is still well entrenched in the atmosphere, though maybe not down at the surface and certainly not in the ocean. But the jet stream is like a very big boat. It takes a long time to turn. It took a better part of 2 years for El Nino to get well entrenched. It's not going to disappear anytime soon, at least into the fall of this year. Some sort of El Nino enhancement is still expected for the jet stream in the North Pacific. Next, we look at the ocean subsurface to see what effects, if anything, or what impact El Nino has. And what we're seeing is certainly not an El Nino pattern. It's clearly a La Nina pattern. That is, here is the West Pacific, here's the East Pacific. We're going down 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters. We see temperature, Celsius degrees here. All warm water, which used to be piled up over here, is sloshing back to the West Pacific. Warm pool building here. The 28-degree isotherm, which was extended the whole way over here into the Galapagos, is continually retreating about every 2 or 3 days. It's moving about a degree further to the west. This clearly indicates the onslaught of La Nina. And then here, the anomalies differences normal for this time of year. You see, instead of warm water working its way like Kelvin waves from west to east, we now see a big pool of cooler than normal water, 3 degrees, almost 4 degrees below normal, sloshing its way in, not like a Kelvin wave, not like a negative Kelvin wave, but like a river of cold water racing to the east, trying to push up and surface, erupt here by the Galapagos. The last of the warm pool of El Nino is right here, this 1 degree little patch, which is almost nothing, and it's steadily pushing off to the west, signaling the demise of El Nino in the ocean and the emergence of La Nina. The high-res chart depicts the exact same thing. Cooler water in control over the entire subsurface region, erupting near the Galapagos, with the last of the warm pool moving off to the west and decaying. And here we go. Here is sea surface temperature data right now. cooler than normal waters, as expected, along the coast of Peru, working their way off to the north. Here's the Galapagos, minus 2 degree anomalies here, and working their way off to the west, reaching to about 135 west. It actually was further over here a couple days ago, so it's retreated a little bit, but still no indication whatsoever that it's going to retreat for very long. And the trend, 7-day trend, clearly shows cooling around the Galapagos, these blues here, and cooling out to about 145 west. Now, there are pockets of little bits of warming here and there, and most interesting, here along the coast of Peru, it was a lot colder, but for the time being, temperatures are rebuilding a little bit. Also, along the California coast, up in this region, this was all cooler due to a big bout of high-pressure north winds. That has backed off now, too, with local low pressure sort of sliding into the area and the jet stream pushing into here. And so water temperatures are starting to rebound a little bit, but that's not any indication of a reemergence of El Nino at all. And then finally, surface water temperatures. Again, there was cooler water last week here along Peru. That's backfilled a little bit and is warmer, but still, there's this thread of cool water running right through the heart of the Nino regions. Now notice there is still much warm water north and south of this, and the real El Nino signature typically looks like warmer than water normal right here, and clearly we see that still, but based on the subsurface water profile, all that cool water basically going from here, rushing this way, we expect over time this thread or this spike of cool water to, if nothing, build and start covering more area and wiping out this warm water. So this warm water is the hangover from El Nino. This cool water is the start of La Nina. And so finally, we look for the effects of El Nino or La Nina on the atmosphere, and for that matter, the Southern Oscillation, the MJO. This is the Southern Oscillation Index, difference in pressure between Tahiti and Darwin. Negative numbers suggest the active phase of the MJO, and you can see in early April, we had a pretty good run of active numbers with this one peak down here at minus 45 associated with tropical activity very near Tahiti. But since then, numbers have started to back off. The active phase of the MJO is fading. It's now positive at 10.30. The 30-day running average, which is used to measure or see look for the presence of the active phase of the MJO, still negative, minus 16.72, not bad, and actually was down to, minus 19 right in here. So a clear sign that there was the active phase of the MJO and El Nino, but that is starting to back off now. And the 90-day running average, still solidly negative, minus 14.99 there. Today it's minus 14.75. Clearly, El Nino still is in control, but the expectation, given everything else we've seen, is that little bit at a time, all these sets of negative numbers are going to slowly start creeping towards neutral. And here's the 30-day SOI chart. You can see here's where El Nino started back in the early 2014. The numbers, you can see the pulses of the inactive and active phases of the MJO. It's bottomed out down around here this year, late 2015 into early 2016. We're just coming out of the active phase of the MJO. This is moving towards the inactive phase now. And we expect at some point this trend line to start working its way up, approaching here by probably in the July-ish time frame, with El Nino slowly fading out. The ESPI index, which is a measure of precipitation rather than pressure, but very much like the Southern Oscillation Index, positive numbers suggest the presence of El Nino, still at 1.03, very good and holding pretty nicely here, and that is due to, again, warmer than normal water over in this part of the Pacific, and enhanced precipitation there. At some point, as cool water builds here, that will not support condensation above it, and less precipitation will develop here, and this number will start falling to neutral, if not negative. So for now, perhaps one last little pulse of northern hemi swell assuming low pressure develops off the Kuril Islands in the next day or so. Little pulse of swell for Hawaii, maybe less for the U.S. West Coast. But really, the focus is now turning towards the southern hemisphere. We have one swell in the water. It's already past Hawaii, starting to build in Southern California. We saw another gale that has already developed. It is creating swell, and 2 or 3 pulses of additional low pressure, reinforcing low pressure, are to develop over the coming week in the deep southern hemisphere, which could make for a good, nice long run of smallish swell targeting the U.S. West Coast. Pretty much to the east, not a whole lot for Hawaii, but California, Mexico, down in that region, Central America, to fare pretty well. So that's it. That's our main swell. El Nino fading out, though it not expected to be completely gone and still influencing the atmosphere even into the coming fall. But at some point, we expect the emergence of La Nina to take over. So that's it for this week. We'll do this again next week. Same time, same channel. See you then. Thanks.